Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
Some people will say that if you are a true believer, that in Christianity that you can't take with total seriousness what is being said and discovered in the scientific world. And on the other hand, I know that there's people who are steeped in the sciences who somehow seem to end up thinking that religion is unimportant or has nothing to say about life, or that it perhaps is a rather childish remnant of an earlier age.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of the synthesis of science and religion. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, it's nice of you to come and take time out from a busy schedule and to speak a bit with me about serious matters. Are you at ease with doing this?
Oh, it looks like a wonderful format for a discussion of anything you can think of.
Well, that's our problem. We have to figure out what we want to talk about. And I thought, since you are a medical doctor, that perhaps we could speak a bit about the relationship of religion and science. I take it that doctors are somehow steeped in the sciences, and since I sometimes play the role of theologian, I thought that perhaps we could speak a bit about that whole relationship between religion and science. When we begin to think about that, certain problems arise, because some people seem to think that these two worlds are incompatible. Some people will say that if you are a true believer, that in Christianity that you can't take with total seriousness what is being said and discovered in the scientific world. And on the other hand, I know that there's people who are steeped in the sciences who somehow seem to end up thinking that religion is unimportant or has nothing to say about life, or that it perhaps is a rather childish remnant of an earlier age. I see that sometimes with students at the university who are studying the sciences, get very immersed in them. They get very taken by the power of science to accomplish things and to change our world, and they begin to wonder, really, well, what can religion do? Why have religion? It doesn't seem to produce anything. There's that sense that religion, therefore, is outmoded, that it was all right to have that when one was a youngster, but now that they're growing up and becoming adults and learning the inside secrets of how nature works and so on, that there really isn't any need anymore for any belief system in their lives. I wondered, in your own training, I was thinking about medical school and so on, and whether you encountered that kind of thing, where people would really be immersed in that kind of world of science.
Well, I think the feeling that you come through medical school with, and anyone who has had a scientific training, is that science has specific answers for specific problems. How to, for example, in medicine, how to cure a certain illness, how to diagnose another problem, and so forth. But then as you gain more experience in the world and in living, you find that science does not have the direct, specific answers for the more important issues of your developing in life, the answer to the ultimate questions. And I think that this is why we should try to see here if science and religion can come together in a common point. And is there a problem between the two?
Well, that's what I was trying to get at. I wonder if, my analysis that indeed often when people are studying the sciences, that somehow the very power of them, the very ability that the scientists have to manipulate and control reality and to really produce concrete results, if that doesn't in a way sort of take over people's understanding of things. Now, I guess it's a question of whether found a lot of people lost their religious faith during medical school, or people who get in, who are doctors, whether they end up sort of playing down the role of religion at all.
I think it's probably a common problem of someone graduating from medical school is that there really hasn't been an emphasis on the religious aspect of the problems that beset the doctor. We're much more comfortable dealing with numbers, figures, very uneasy dealing with people's anxieties, and probably our own anxieties, since we do not usually have the answers to the questions that these people are facing. And when you study science, you live in a sort of an illusory world where you think you have the answers for everything. You think, and finally you have a great faith in science, that science will somehow solve all the riddles of your life. And you find that this is sorely lacking at the end of your training. You say, I'm not prepared to deal with these issues.
With the kind of deeper life questions that come up with people.
And you ask, where has science failed me? Why can't science come to the answers? And why can't science pull God out of the atmosphere? Why can't science burrow down to the ultimate nature of the universe?
Mm-hmm. I was thinking that this becomes really the problem that religion faces, is when science tries to take over somehow as a total world view, a complete explanation of what reality is all about. I think we've seen that happen historically. We've seen where science has attempted to say that it has the total or final answer to things. I think very often it is that question of the scientific method taking over. When we're talking about scientific method, I guess in my own mind I'm thinking in terms of the empirical method, the kind of method that says that what is quantifiable or what can be measured is what is real. The business of being able to produce concrete and clear results, the ability to repeat experiments and to show the universal laws of nature. It is very much of an empirical method. I guess philosophically this goes back to the time of Francis Bacon and already back in the 16th century, where the idea was that that science can make a difference in the world, that the empirical method gives us control or power over what exists. And I think as people adopted that empirical method that Bacon suggested, and the scientific revolution took over, that there were indeed these tremendous advances, and people really were able to make a difference in the world. And as a result, I think that methodology became the important thing. People said, aha, that is what is real. What is real is what is empirically verifiable. And I think that, I suppose physics has always been the great touchstone for that. Physicists can predict what is going to happen. Physicists make a difference in the world. And it seems to me that what has happened is that those hard sciences that concentrate on data have sort of won the day in the academic world, or perhaps in the population as a whole. And other people said, well, we have to work like that too. I think of the field of psychology, which borrowed so much of that model of physics, so that psychology, which is supposedly dealing with the human psyche, with the spirit, the soul, with things that appear to be intangible, went in the direction of wanting to have hard data, as we might find in the physical sciences, and wanting to measure things, and people getting the grant money if they're able to do that measuring and produce clear results. I think from my perspective, I see that, or saw that happening in many of the other disciplines. I think it took over in maybe the area of sociology, where you got this tremendous emphasis on collecting data and having charts and being able to predict what was going to happen in the society. Perhaps political science, I've heard people talk in that area the same way, that they feel infested in a way with a certain empiricism that wants to fasten in on what is verifiable through some sort of experimentation. So I think this all represents this problem that we're getting at, that the model of what produces is what people are influenced by, something that works. Like we can, through our physical sciences, we can get a man to the moon. And that's clearly an impressive kind of accomplishment. And so I think other people begin to say, aha, that is the method by which we could deal with all of our problems. I think science sort of took over that idea in a way, that it was this total world view. And speaking as a theologian, therefore, that is when I get nervous about the whole thing, or when I begin to want to critique what science is saying, when it wants to masquerade, in a sense, as a religion. On the other hand, when science is going about its business of looking at our world and analyzing it and trying to help us to understand it and so on, then I think from my own Christian perspective, I have to say, good work. I mean, go to it. I wouldn't ever want to limit that work of science in any way. I wouldn't want to say, well, let's hold back, or we can't really explore this frontier of human knowledge. I think that would be a mistake. In fact, I think that just the opposite, that Christian outlook would suggest that we be passionate about uncovering the secrets of the world.
Well, I think I agree with the analysis. Most people tend to look at science as sort of an austere, cold world. You have facts and figures, you analyze, you make up hypotheses, you prove them, and then you can act on nature. And somehow they don't see it as a creative act. It certainly is, in its finest moments, a very creative thing, as creative as making music or drawing a picture, writing a poem. And science has to be seen in this light in order, I think, to be welcomed into every man's experience. They can't see it as something apart. And as we have been studying in the course on Teilhard de Chardin, he was probably a key figure in joining the two tendencies, the one towards analysis and uncovering the mysteries of nature, and also in dealing with the great issues of the mystery that surrounds us. You know, as we know, he was both a very well-respected scientist and a well-respected theologian. I think in him I find the best example of probably the attitude to assume in the 20th century and hereafter as far as what place will science and religion play in our lives. You might elaborate a little bit about, from a theologian's viewpoint, how Teilhard's science has affected the course of theology since he came on the scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he is certainly a representative figure, and a good one for us to talk about, since you and I have been doing a course together on Teilhard de Chardin and reading some of his material and so on. And I think that, as you point out, he is a good example of a man who wrestled mightily with this question of reconciling the claims of science and the claims of his traditional faith. He died as recently as 1955, spent much of dominated much of the thinking of the 20th century, and been very influential in Catholic circles in the recent past. Well, during his lifetime, he was not able to publish his works. He was known in certain academic circles and among people who were wrestling with the similar problem of the reconciliation of science and religion. And Teilhard does, I think, have important things for us to examine in this regard. I think that part of that was his need to reinterpret his Christian faith in the light of his science. I think that if we're going to effect a reconciliation between the two, then from the theologian side, we have to be able to understand and explain our Christian faith so that a person of scientific background can make sense out of it or understand what we're saying. So in the past, very often, it seems, with Christian theology is that we didn't really attend to that. It was a matter of just repeating the doctrines and the dogmas, or giving our usual traditional explanation of things, which was really based on a very primitive science by our standards. You know, much of theology was influenced by Thomas Aquinas, who in turn was influenced by Aristotle. And Aristotle's approach to science dominated for many centuries, I guess, until we get into the time of Bacon in the 16th century. when that was gradually overthrown. But Aristotle's approach was far different. He talked a lot about the four causes and investigating reality from that kind of perspective. And the kind of method of hypothesis and testing through experimentation that we know in the modern world, that rigorously empirical method, was foreign to that approach. And so much of the theology that we have had to present to people in the past had that character of this old classical, Thomistic, Aristotelian approach to the world. And much of the analysis was in terms of things like substance and accident, for example, things which came to mean little or nothing to modern people. So when the theologian begins to respond to the modern scientific mood, there has to be this reinterpretation of the Christian dogmas. There has to be a way of saying them that fits into an evolutionary framework. And that, I think, is one of the ways that Teilhard made a great contribution to the whole dialogue that we're talking about. When you studied religion yourself, and we're doing this business of trying to reconcile science and religion, I presume you were still working with sort of a traditional understanding of the Christian faith.
Traditional in the sense that if we say our Christian faith is grounded in the Bible, we have to deal with the stories that are quite familiar to every child who has any religious training. Adam and Eve, for example. You can even talk about the resurrection if you want. But take a story like Adam and Eve. You come through life till you hit college. Suddenly Adam and Eve is very difficult to understand because you have, on the other hand, a professor telling you about evolution and that somehow you are from the stars and there's a great process that's been going on for billions of years that has brought you here. So you suddenly you have no way to deal with the conflict. And your church training has provided none of this. There's been no real voicing of the scientific attitude, and in fact it was always probably tacitly understood by everyone that it was somehow irreverent. And I'm not sure I really see the attitude changing as yet, not being in the heartland of recent Catholic training. I don't know how the youngsters are being raised, but at least in my experience, and I take this back to the 60s, that would have been when my early training was, there was no emphasis on science. Science was something done elsewhere, probably a heathen activity, and often coming to conclusions that wouldn't save your soul.
And that again highlights this great value of Teilhard de Chardin's thought, the Jesuit paleontologist and religious visionary. And let's take up just maybe one part of what he taught that to try to exemplify this whole thing. And that would be his very image of who God is and what kind of a picture one would get of God. Because he tried to find a way of talking about God so that modern scientific people could understand it. And of course he was working out of a sense that the world was evolving. He bought into the whole notion of evolution very heavily. In fact, he had that famous phrase that evolution was a light in which all facts should be examined. It was the idea, the sort of general perspective with which we had to look at our world. And so Teilhard, in looking at that, and he went back to look at his traditional notion of God and how God operated with us, and he found a lot of difficulties with that because he was working with that very transcendent notion of God. Put popularly, we would say that God was the one who was up there above the world, sort of looking down on it, and in a sense detached from this world. And very often that God was sort of a judging God, and he didn't really have a lot of use for the activity that was going on in the world. The picture might be that people in the world were sort of just going through the motions until they would reach the point of death and then could be brought into the real life of union with God. Well, Teilhard said that that was really unacceptable to him as a scientist, and probably unacceptable to many people who partake of the contemporary worldview or outlook on what the world is all about, who have a sense of the evolutionary and progressive character of the world. So Teilhard said, well, we have to rethink who God is. And for him, therefore, God became much more immanent rather than transcendent. And what we mean by that is that God is seen as within the process of evolution. He is seen as the energizing force which sort of propels this process of the world towards its final fulfillment. God is the one who is to be found in human experience. God is the one who is behind the whole process of history as we know it. He can be thought of as the goal of the process, which is trying to pull people towards himself and to try to pull the whole world towards himself. And this God turns out to be one who takes very seriously the human endeavor, so that you get a picture here that people are called upon to cooperate with this God in building the earth, as Teilhard said, and creating a community of love. So that human activity of any kind, whether it is functioning as a doctor or as a teacher or working in the factory or raising children, all of our constructive human efforts in Teilhard's thought had a very positive kind of element in them. They were seen as being something worthwhile in themselves. It wasn't just that believers would say a prayer in the morning, a morning offering, and therefore everything they did through the day would be holy, but it would be just the pure fact of getting up and going to the job and doing a good job would have an intrinsic worth. Why? Because we would be cooperating in that act with the God who's still creating the world, who's continually creating it from moment to moment, who's trying to spread his kingdom of love. So we begin, you see, to get a very different picture, one that I think ends up being more appealing to the modern scientist or to the average person who is influenced by science. As I'm saying that, Tom, does that ring any bells with you, or do you find it appealing in any way? Or
I think I find it appealing in that it helps me put God and my experience closer together. I think a devil's advocate might say, well, how do you measure God in this great process of evolution, and how can you prove to me that it has any purpose and that it's a progressive thing, goal-directed? I'm not sure Teilhard could measure God in anything the way a scientist would want it measured and quantified, probably because it's impossible to do so. And that's where he lends the aspect of the believer and the faithful scientist to his work, and makes an interpretation of what he sees more religious than scientific ultimately. I think Teilhard lost a lot of his scientific friends when he got on to the point of interpreting just what evolution meant. And when he started talking about his famous concept of the omega point, that Christ himself is the center which attracts all of us, all of matter, developing into its fullest potential and uniting it in itself. He lost a lot of the scientists. They said, this is crazy. But to me, he's provided a way to see a purpose in such a grand machine, if you want to call the universe. It seems to be too grand and too wonderful to just be some sort of unpurposeful statistical eruption of coincidences, I suppose you'd have to say. So Teilhard, to me, has provided that essential link of the heart and the mind, I think.
There's a couple points I'd like to pick up that you made there, Tom. One, it links us up with our previous problem, where we said that the problem that the theologian has with science is when it wants to become a world view, a total picture of reality. And you said, well, how could you measure God in this picture? And I think what the theologian is trying to say is, no, science can't do that. That's exactly the problem. There's things around that can't be measured by empirical method.
that the world is bigger than just what can be perceived by our senses or logically deduced, that there is an element of mystery in this world, that there's a larger picture or framework within which we have to look at our lives, that this is not a self-contained system, but it opens up to something bigger or larger. And I think that that is the theologian's fundamental answer, that that's the work of religion to see that, to talk about purpose and meaning, to talk about the large picture within which we have to place ourselves, to look at the whole tendency of what this universe is all about. And what the theologian is going to say, of course, is that all of this fits into a framework of meaning, that it has a purpose in all of it, and that we find God not as one element within this scientific worldview, like where is he or how do I measure him, but we find God as the overall meaning of the system, as the source of the energy that is found in the system to begin with, and as the goal towards which the system is moving. So God is seen as the condition of the very possibility of all of this. God is seen as the one towards which the whole evolutionary process is moving. Now, those are all faith statements. They really are not subject to empirical analysis. One can't weigh it out or measure it out in any particular way. But one can, as a theologian, try to say, hey, there's evidence for that, which I think you said well in saying that, I mean, the sense of purposefulness in the world, I mean, the grand design, the mysterious character of the universe as we know it, its immensity, the long duration of time, all of those things may help us to move in the direction of saying, well, our faith is a reasonable way of looking at this world, that when you look at it as a self-contained unit, it really doesn't make sense. It really turns out to be a rather absurd place. So I think in your comments, that's one thing that I pick up that sort of highlights the whole structure of our conversation here, I think. The problem is when science is a total worldview, and the answer that the theologian has is to say it can't do that. It's on faulty ground, and it's doing more than it was ever designed to do when it tries to play the role of philosophy or theology. Theology is the one that the area where we begin to talk about this larger purpose and meaning. And quickly, the other point I picked up from you is the need for flesh and blood people who are able to do this, to combine the head and the heart, to put the scientific mentality together with a larger system of belief. That really seems to me to be an important thing. And for us, Teilhard de Chardin certainly represents a model of that, the scientist who was able to combine that with his deepest religious convictions.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Tom Hadley, a physician from Fremont. The topic of this week's Reflections was the synthesis of science and religion. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner.